of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 21. Mr. Perkins soon saw that his words had had no effect on Philip, and for the rest of the term ignored him. He wrote a report which was vitriolic. When it arrived and Aunt Louisa asked Philip what it was like, he answered cheerfully, "Rotten." "Is it?" said the Vicar. "I must look at it again. Do you think there's any use in my staying on at Tercanbury? I should have thought it would be better if I went to Germany for a bit." "What has put that in your head?" said Aunt Louisa. "Don't you think it's rather a good idea?" Sharp had already left King's School, and had written to Philip from Hanover. He was really starting life, and it made Philip more restless to think of it. He felt he could not bear another year of restraint. "But then you won't get a scholarship." "I haven't a chance of getting one anyhow. And besides, I don't know that I particularly want to go to Oxford." "But if you're going to be ordained, Philip!" Aunt Louisa exclaimed in dismay. "I've given up that idea long ago." Mrs. Carey looked at him with startled eyes, and then, used to self-restraint, she poured out another cup of tea for his uncle. They did not speak. In a moment Philip saw tears slowly falling down her cheeks. His heart was suddenly wrung because he caused her pain. In her tight black dress, made by the dressmaker down the street, with her wrinkled face and pale, tired eyes, her gray hair still done in the frivolous ringlets of her youth, she was a ridiculous but strangely pathetic figure. Philip saw it for the first time. Afterwards, when the Vicar was shut up in his study with the curate, he put his arms round her waist. "I say, I'm sorry you're upset, Aunt Louisa," he said. "But it's no good my being ordained if I haven't a real vocation, is it?" "I'm so disappointed, Philip," she moaned. "I'd set my heart on it. I thought you could be your uncle's curate, and then when our time came— After all, we can't last for ever, can we? You might have taken his place." Philip shivered. He was seized with panic. His heart beat like a pigeon in a trap beating with its wings. His aunt wept softly, her head upon his shoulder. "I wish you'd persuade Uncle William to let me leave Tercanbury. I'm so sick of it." But the Vicar of Blackstable did not easily alter any arrangements he had made, and it had always been intended that Philip should stay at King's School till he was 18, and should then go to Oxford. At all events he would not hear of Philip leaving then, for no notice had been given, and the term's fee would have to be paid in any case. "Then will you give notice for me to leave at Christmas?" said Philip at the end of a long and often bitter conversation. "I'll write to Mr. Perkins about it and see what he says." "Oh, I wish to goodness I were 21. It is awful to be at somebody else's beck and call." "Philip, you shouldn't speak to your uncle like that," said Mrs. Carey gently. "But don't you see that Perkins will want me to stay? He gets so much ahead for every chap in the school." "Why don't you want to go to Oxford?" "What's the good if I'm not going into the church?" "You can't go into the church. You're in the church already," said the Vicar. "Ordained, then," replied Philip impatiently. "What are you going to be, Philip?" asked Mrs. Carey. "I don't know. I've not made up my mind, but whatever I am, it'll be useful to know foreign languages. I shall get far more out of a year in Germany than by staying on at that hole." He would not say that he felt Oxford would be little better than a continuation of his life at school. He wished immensely to be his own master. Besides, he would be known to a certain extent among old schoolfellows, and he wanted to get away from them all. He felt that his life at school had been a failure. He wanted to start fresh. It happened that his desire to go to Germany fell in with certain ideas which had been of late discussed at Blackstable. Sometimes friends came to stay with the doctor and brought news of the world outside. And the visitors spending August by the sea had their own way of looking at things. The Vicar had heard that there were people who did not think the old-fashioned education so useful nowadays as it had been in the past, and modern languages were gaining an importance which they had not had in his own youth. His own mind was divided, for a younger brother of his had been sent to Germany when he failed in some examination, thus creating a precedent, but since he had there died of typhoid it was impossible to look upon the experiment as other than dangerous. The result of innumerable conversations was that Philip should go back to Tercanbury for another term, and then should leave. With this agreement Philip was not dissatisfied, but when he had been back a few days the headmaster spoke to him. "I've had a letter from your uncle. It appears you want to go to Germany, and he asked me what I think about it." Philip was astounded. He was furious with his guardian for going back on his word. "I thought it was settled, sir," he said. "Far from it. I've written to say I think it is the greatest mistake to take you away." Philip immediately sat down and wrote a violent letter to his uncle. He did not measure his language. He was so angry that he could not get to sleep till quite late that night, and he awoke in the early morning and began brooding over the way they had treated him. He waited impatiently for an answer. In 2 or 3 days it came. It was a mild, pained letter from Aunt Louisa, saying that he should not write such things to his uncle, who was very much distressed. He was unkind and unchristian. He must know they were only trying to do their best for him, and they were so much older than he that they must be better judges of what was good for him. Philip clenched his hands. He had heard that statement so often, and he could not see why it was true. They did not know the conditions as he did. Why should they accept as self-evident that their greater age gave them greater wisdom? The letter ended with the information that Mr. Carey had withdrawn the notice he had given. Philip nursed his wrath till the next half-holiday. They had them on Tuesdays and Thursdays, since on Saturday afternoons they had to go to a service in the cathedral. He stopped behind when the rest of the Sixth went out. "May I go to Blackstable this afternoon, please, sir?" he asked. "No," said the headmaster briefly. "I wanted to see my uncle about something very important." "Didn't you hear me say no?" Philip did not answer. He went out. He felt almost sick with humiliation, the humiliation of having to ask, and the humiliation of the curt refusal. He hated the headmaster now. Philip writhed under that despotism which never vouchsafed a reason for the most tyrannous act. He was too angry to care what he did, and after dinner walked down to the station by the back ways he knew so well, just in time to catch the train to Blackstable. He walked into the vicarage and found his uncle and aunt sitting in the dining room. "Hello, where have you sprung from?" said the vicar. It was very clear that he was not pleased to see him. He looked a little uneasy. "I thought I'd come and see you about my leaving. I wanted to know what you mean by promising me one thing when I was here and doing something different a week later." He was a little frightened at his own boldness, but he had made up his mind exactly what words to use, and though his heart beat violently, he forced himself to say them. "Have you got leave to come here this afternoon?" "No. I asked Perkins and he refused. If you like to write and tell him I've been here, you can get me into a really fine old row." Mrs. Carey sat knitting with trembling hands. She was unused to scenes, and they agitated her extremely. "It would serve you right if I told him," said Mr. Carey. "If you like to be a perfect sneak, you can. After writing to Perkins as you did, you're quite capable of it." It was foolish of Philip to say that, because it gave the vicar exactly the opportunity he wanted. "I'm not going to sit still while you say impertinent things to me," he said with dignity. He got up and walked quickly out of the room into his study. Philip heard him shut the door and lock it. "Oh, I wish to God I were 21. It is awful to be tied down like this." Aunt Louisa began to cry quietly. "Oh, Philip, you oughtn't to have spoken to your uncle like that. Do please go and tell him you're sorry." "I'm not in the least sorry. He's taking a mean advantage. Of course it's just waste of money keeping me on at school, but what does he care? It's not his money. It was cruel to put me under the guardianship of people who know nothing about things." "Philip!" Philip, in his voluble anger, stopped suddenly at the sound of her voice. It was broken-hearted. He had not realized what bitter things he was saying. "Philip, how can you be so unkind? You know we are only trying to do our best for you, and we know that we have no experience. It isn't as if we had any children of our own. That's why we consulted Mr. Perkins." Her voice broke. "I've tried to be like a mother to you. I've loved you as if you were my own son." She was so small and frail, There was something so pathetic in her old maidish air that Philip was touched. A great lump came suddenly in his throat and his eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to be beastly." He knelt down beside her and took her in his arms and kissed her wet, withered cheeks. She sobbed bitterly, and he seemed to feel on a sudden the pity of that wasted life. She had never surrendered herself before to such a display of emotion. "I know I've not been what I wanted to be to you, Philip, but I didn't know how. It's been just as dreadful for me to have no children as for you to have no mother." Philip forgot his anger and his own concerns, but thought only of consoling her with broken words and clumsy little caresses. Then the clock struck, and he had to bolt off at once to catch the only train that would get him back to Tercanbury in time for call over. As he sat in the corner of the railway carriage, he saw that he had done nothing. He was angry with himself for his weakness. It was despicable to have allowed himself to be turned from his purpose by the pompous airs of the Vicar and the tears of his aunt. But as the result of he knew not what conversations between the couple, another letter was written to the headmaster. Mr. Perkins read it with an impatient shrug of the shoulders. He showed it to Philip. It ran: Dear Mr. Perkins, forgive me for troubling you again about my ward, but both his aunt and I have been uneasy about him. He seems very anxious to leave school, and his aunt thinks he is unhappy. It is very difficult for us to know what to do, as we are not his parents. He does not seem to think he is doing very well, and he feels it is wasting his money to stay on. I should be very much obliged if you would have a talk to him, and if he is still of the same mind perhaps it would be better if he left at Christmas as I originally intended. Yours very truly, William Carey. Philip gave him back the letter. He felt a thrill of pride in his triumph. He had got his own way, and he was satisfied. His will had gained a victory over the wills of others. "It's not much good my spending half an hour writing to your uncle if he changes his mind the next letter he gets from you," said the headmaster irritably. Philip said nothing, and his face was perfectly placid, but he could not prevent the twinkle in his eyes. Mr. Perkins noticed it and broke into a little laugh. "You've rather scored, haven't you?" he said. Then Philip smiled outright. He could not conceal his exultation. "Is it true that you're very anxious to leave?" "Yes, sir." "Are you unhappy here?" Philip blushed. He hated instinctively any attempt to get into the depths of his feelings. "Oh, I don't know, sir." Mr. Perkins, slowly dragging his fingers through his beard, looked at him thoughtfully. He seemed to speak almost to himself. "Of course, schools are made for the average. The holes are all round, and whatever shape the pegs are they must wedge in somehow. One hasn't time to bother about anything but the average." Then suddenly he addressed himself to Philip. "Look here, I've got a suggestion to make to you. It's getting on towards the end of the term now. Another term won't kill you, and if you want to go to Germany you'd better go after Easter than after Christmas. It'll be much pleasanter in the spring than in midwinter. If at the end of the next term you still want to go, I'll make no objection. What do you say to that?" "Thank you very much, sir." Philip was so glad to have gained the last 3 months that he did not mind the extra term. The school seemed less of a prison when he knew that before Easter he would be free from it for ever. His heart danced within him. That evening in chapel he looked round at the boys, standing according to their forms, each in his due place, and he chuckled with satisfaction at the thought that soon he would never see them again. It made him regard them almost with a friendly feeling. His eyes rested on Rose. Rose took his position as a monitor very seriously. He had quite an idea of being a good influence in the school. It was his turn to read the lesson that evening, and he read it very well. Philip smiled when he thought that he would be rid of him for ever, and it would not matter in 6 months whether Rose was tall and straight-limbed, and where would the importance be that he was a monitor and captain of the 11th? Philip looked at the masters in their gowns. Gordon was dead. He had died of apoplexy 2 years before. but all the rest were there. Philip knew now what a poor lot they were, except Turner perhaps. There was something of a man in him. And he writhed at the thought of the subjection in which they had held him. In 6 months they would not matter either. Their praise would mean nothing to him, and he would shrug his shoulders at their censure. Philip had learned not to express his emotions by outward signs, and shyness still tormented him, but he had often very high spirits. And then, though he limped about demurely, silent and reserved, it seemed to be hallooing in his heart. He seemed to himself to walk more lightly. All sorts of ideas danced through his head, fancies chased one another so furiously that he could not catch them. But their coming and their going filled him with exhilaration. Now, being happy, he was able to work, and during the remaining weeks of the term set himself to make up for his long neglect. His brain worked easily, and he took a keen pleasure in the activity of his intellect. He did very well in the examinations that closed the term. Mr. Perkins made only one remark. He was talking to him about an essay he had written, and, after the usual criticism, said, "So you've made up your mind to stop playing the fool for a bit, have you?" He smiled at him with his shining teeth, and Philip, looking down, gave an embarrassed smile. The half-dozen boys who expected to divide between them the various prizes which were given at the end of the summer term had ceased to look upon Philip as a serious rival, but now they began to regard him with some uneasiness. He told no one that he was leaving at Easter, and so was in no sense a competitor, but left them to their anxieties. He knew that Rose flattered himself on his French, for he had spent 2 or 3 holidays in France, and he expected to get the Dean's prize for English essay. Philip got a good deal of satisfaction in watching his dismay when he saw how much better Philip was doing in these subjects than himself. Another fellow, Norton, could not go to Oxford unless he got one of the scholarships at the disposal of the school. He asked Philip if he was going in for them. "Have you any objection?" asked Philip. It entertained him to think that he held someone else's future in his hand. There was something romantic in getting these various rewards actually in his grasp, and then leaving them to others because he disdained them. At last the breaking up day came, and he went to Mr. Perkins to bid him good bye. "You don't mean to say you really want to leave?" Philip's face fell at the headmaster's evident surprise. "You said you wouldn't put any objection in the way, sir," he answered. "I thought it was only a whim that I'd better humour. I know you're obstinate and headstrong. What on earth do you want to leave for now? You've only got another term in any case. You can get the Magdalen scholarship easily. You'll get half the prizes we've got to give." Philip looked at him sullenly. He felt that he had been tricked, but he had the promise, and Perkins would have to stand by it. "You'll have a very pleasant time at Oxford. You needn't decide at once what you're going to do afterwards. I wonder if you realize how delightful the life is up there for anyone who has brains." "I've made all my arrangements now to go to Germany, sir," said Philip. "Are they arrangements that couldn't possibly be altered?" asked Mr. Perkins with his quizzical smile. "I shall be very sorry to lose you. In schools, the rather stupid boys who work always do better than the clever boys who's idle, but when the clever boy works, why then he does what you've done this term." Philip flushed darkly. He was unused to compliments, and no one had ever told him he was clever. The headmaster put his hand on Philip's shoulder. "You know, driving things into the heads of thick-witted boys is dull work, but when now and then you have the chance of teaching a boy who comes half-way towards you, who understands almost before you've got the words out of your mouth, why, then teaching is the most exhilarating thing in the world." Philip was melted by kindness. It had never occurred to him that it mattered really to Mr. Perkins whether he went or stayed. He was touched and immensely flattered. It would be pleasant to end his school days with glory and then go to Oxford. In a flash there appeared before him the life which he had heard described from boys who came back to play in the O.K.S. match, or in letters from the university read out in one of the studies. But he was ashamed. He would look such a fool in his own eyes if he gave in now. His uncle would chuckle at the success of the headmaster's ruse. It was rather a come down from the dramatic surrender of all these prizes which were in his reach, because he disdained to take them, to the plain, ordinary winning of them. It only required a little more persuasion, just enough to save his self-respect, and Philip would have done anything that Mr. Perkins wished. But his face showed nothing of his conflicting emotions. It was placid and sullen. "I think I'd rather go, sir," he said. Mr. Perkins, like many men who manage things by their personal influence, grew a little impatient when his power was not immediately manifest. He had a great deal of work to do and could not waste more time on a boy who seemed to him insanely obstinate. "Very well. I promised to let you if you really wanted it, and I keep my promise. When do you go to Germany?" Philip's heart beat violently. The battle was won, and he did not know whether he had not rather lost it. "At the beginning of May, sir," he answered. "Well, you must come and see us when you get back." He held out his hand. If he had given him one more chance, Philip would have changed his mind, but he seemed to look upon the matter as settled. Philip walked out of the house. His school days were over and he was free. But the wild exultation to which he had looked forward at that moment was not there. He walked round the precincts slowly, and a profound depression seized him. He wished now that he had not been foolish. He did not want to go, but he knew he could never bring himself to go to the headmaster and tell him he would stay. That was a humiliation he could never put upon himself. He wondered whether he had done right. He was dissatisfied with himself and with all his circumstances. He asked himself dully whether whenever you got your way you wished afterwards that you hadn't. Chapter 21. Chapter 22. Philip's uncle had an old friend called Miss Wilkinson who lived in Berlin. She was the daughter of a clergyman, and it was with her father, the rector of a village in Lincolnshire, that Mr. Carey had spent his last curacy. On his death, forced to earn her living, she had taken various situations as a governess in France and Germany. She had kept up correspondence with Mrs. Carey, and 2 or 3 times had spent her holidays at Blackstable Vicarage, paying, as was usual with the Careys' unfrequent guests, a small sum for her keep. When it became clear that it was less trouble to yield to Philip's wishes than to resist them, Mrs. Carey wrote to ask her for advice. Miss Wilkinson recommended Heidelberg as an excellent place to learn German in, and the house of Frau Professor Erlin as a comfortable home. Philip might live there for 30 marks a week, and the professor himself, a teacher at the local high school, would instruct him. Philip arrived in Heidelberg one morning in May. His things were put on a barrow, and he followed the porter out of the station. The sky was bright blue, and the trees in the avenue through which they passed were thick with leaves. There was something in the air fresh to Philip, and mingled with the timidity he felt at entering on a new life, among strangers, was a great exhilaration. He was a little disconsolate that no one had come to meet him, and felt very shy when the porter left him at the front door of a big white house. An untidy lad led him in and took him into a drawing-room. It was filled with a large suite covered in green velvet, and in the middle was a round table. On this in water stood a bouquet of flowers tightly packed together in a paper frill like the bone of a mutton chop, and carefully spaced round it were books in leather bindings. There was a musty smell. Presently, with an odour of cooking, the Frau Professor came in, a short, very stout woman with tightly dressed hair and a red face. She had little eyes, sparkling like beads, and an effusive manner. She took both Philip's hands and asked him about Miss Wilkinson, who had twice spent a few weeks with her. She spoke in German and in broken English. Philip could not make her understand that he did not know Miss Wilkinson. Then her 2 daughters appeared. They seemed hardly young to Philip, but perhaps they were not more than 25. The elder, Thekla, was as short as her mother, with the same rather shifty hair, but with a pretty face and abundant dark hair. Anna, her younger sister, was tall and plain, but since she had a pleasant smile, Philip immediately preferred her. After a few minutes of polite conversation, the Frau Professor took Philip to his room and left him. It was in a turret looking over the tops of the trees in the Anlage, and the bed was in an alcove, so that when you sat at the desk it had not the look of a bedroom at all. Philip unpacked his things and set out all his books. He was his own master at last. A bell summoned him to dinner at 1 o'clock, and he found the Frau Professor's guests assembled in the drawing room. He was introduced to her husband, a tall man of middle age with a large fair head turning now to gray and mild blue eyes. He spoke to Philip in correct, rather archaic English, having learned it from a study of the English classics, not from conversation, and it was odd to hear him use words colloquially which Philip had only met in the plays of Shakespeare. Frau Professor Erlin called her establishment a family and not a pension, but it would have required the subtlety of a metaphysician to find out exactly where the difference lay. When they sat down to dinner in the long dark apartment that led out of the drawing room, Philip, feeling very shy, saw that there were 16 people. The Frau Professor sat at one end and carved. The service was conducted with a great clattering of plates by the same clumsy lout who had opened the door for him, and though he was quick it happened that the first persons to be served had finished before the last had received their appointed portions. The Frau Professor insisted that nothing but German should be spoken, so that Philip, even if his bashfulness had permitted him to be talkative, was forced to hold his tongue. He looked at the people among whom he was to live. By the Frau Professor sat several old ladies, but Philip did not give them much of his attention. There were 2 young girls, both fair and one of them very pretty, whom Philip heard addressed as Fraulein Hedwig and Fraulein Cacilie. Fraulein Cacilie had a long pigtail hanging down her back. They sat side by side and chattered to one another with smothered laughter. Now and then they glanced at Philip, and one of them said something in an undertone. They both giggled, and Philip blushed awkwardly, feeling that they were making fun of him. Near them sat a Chinaman with a yellow face and an expansive smile, who was studying Western conditions at the university. He spoke so quickly with a queer accent that the girls could not always understand him, and then they burst out laughing. He laughed too, good-humouredly, and his almond eyes almost closed as he did so. There were 2 or 3 American men in black coats, rather yellow and dry of skin. They were theological students. Philip heard the twang of their New England accent through their bad German, and he glanced at them with suspicion, for he had been taught to look upon Americans as wild and desperate barbarians. Afterwards, when they had sat for a little on the stiff green velvet chairs of the drawing room, Fraulein Anna asked Philip if he would like to go for a walk with them. Philip accepted the invitation. They were quite a party. There were the 2 daughters of the Frau Professor, the 2 other girls, one of the American students, and Philip. Philip walked by the side of Anna and Fraulein Hedwig. He was a little fluttered. He had never known any girls. At Blackstable there were only the farmers' daughters and the girls of the local tradesmen. He knew them by name and by sight, but he was timid, and he thought they laughed at his deformity. He accepted willingly the difference which the vicar and Mrs. Carey put between their own exalted rank and that of the farmers. The doctor had 2 daughters, but they were both much older than Philip and had been married to successive assistants while Philip was still a small boy. At school there had been 2 or 3 girls of more boldness than modesty whom some of the boys knew, and desperate stories, due in all probability to the masculine imagination, were told of intrigues with them. But Philip had always concealed under a lofty contempt the terror with which they filled him. His imagination and the books he had read had inspired in him a desire for the Byronic attitude, and he was torn between a morbid self-consciousness and a conviction that he owed it to himself to be gallant. He felt now that he should be bright and amusing, but his brain seemed empty, and he could not for the life of him think of anything to say. Fraulein Anna, the Frau Professor's daughter, addressed herself to him frequently from a sense of duty, but the other said little. She looked at him now and then with sparkling eyes, and sometimes to his confusion laughed outright. Philip felt that she thought him perfectly ridiculous. They walked along the side of a hill among pine trees, and their pleasant odor caused Philip a keen delight. The day was warm and cloudless. At last they came to an eminence from which they saw the valley of the Rhine spread out before them under the sun. It was a vast stretch of country, sparkling with golden light, with cities in the distance, and through it meandered the silver riband of the river. Wide spaces are rare in the corner of Kent which Philip knew. The sea offers the only broad horizon, and the immense distance he saw now gave him a peculiar and indescribable thrill. He felt suddenly elated. Though he did not know it, it was the first time that he had experienced, quite undiluted with foreign emotions, the sense of beauty. They sat on a bench, the three of them, for the others had gone on, and while the girls talked in rapid German, Philip, indifferent to their proximity, feasted his eyes. "By Jove, I am happy," he said to himself unconsciously. Chapter 23. Philip thought occasionally of the King's School at Tercanbury, and laughed to himself as he remembered what at some particular moment of the day they were doing. Now and then he dreamed that he was still there, and it gave him an extraordinary satisfaction, on awaking, to realize that he was in his little room in the turret. From his bed he could see the great cumulus clouds that hung in the blue sky. He revelled in his freedom. He could go to bed when he chose, and get up when the fancy took him. There was no one to order him about. It struck him that he need not tell any more lies. It had been arranged that Professor Erlin should teach him Latin and German. A Frenchman came every day to give him lessons in French, and the Frau Professor had recommended for mathematics an Englishman who was taking a philological degree at the university. This was a man named Wharton. Philip went to him every morning. He lived in one room on the top floor of a shabby house. It was dirty and untidy, and it was filled with a pungent odor made up of many different stinks. He was generally in bed when Philip arrived at 10 o'clock, and he jumped out, put on a filthy dressing gown and felt slippers, and, while he gave instruction, ate his simple breakfast. He was a short man, stout from excessive beer drinking, with a heavy moustache and long unkempt hair. He had been in Germany for 5 years and was become very Teutonic. He spoke with scorn of Cambridge, where he had taken his degree, and with horror of the life which awaited him when, having taken his doctorate in Heidelberg, he must return to England and a pedagogic career. He adored the life of the German university with its happy freedom and its jolly companionships. He was a member of the Burschenschaft and promised to take Philip to a Kneipe. He was very poor, and made no secret that the lessons he was giving Philip meant the difference between meat for his dinner and bread and cheese. Sometimes after a heavy night he had such a headache that he could not drink his coffee, and he gave his lesson with heaviness of spirit. For these occasions he kept a few bottles of beer under the bed, and one of these and a pipe would help him to bear the burden of life. "A hair of the dog that bit him," he would say as he poured out the beer carefully so that the foam should not make him wait too long to drink. Then he would talk to Philip of the university, the quarrels between rival corps, the duels, and the merits of this and that professor. Philip learnt more of life from him than of mathematics. Sometimes Wharton would sit back with a laugh and say, "Look here, we've not done anything today. You needn't pay me for the lesson." "Oh, it doesn't matter," said Philip. This was something new and very interesting, and he felt that it was of greater import than trigonometry, which he never could understand. It was like a window on life that he had a chance of peeping through, and he looked with a wildly beating heart. "No, you can keep your dirty money," said Wharton. "But how about your dinner?" said Philip with a smile, for he knew exactly how his master's finances stood. Wharton had even asked him to pay him the 2 shillings which the lesson cost once a week rather than once a month, since it made things less complicated. "Oh, never mind my dinner. It won't be the first time I've dined off a bottle of beer, and my mind's never clearer than when I do." He dived under the bed, the sheets were gray with want of washing, and fished out another bottle. Philip, who was young and did not know the good things of life, refused to share it with him, so he drank alone. "How long are you going to stay here?" asked Wharton. Both he and Philip had given up with relief the pretence of mathematics. "Oh, I don't know. I suppose about a year. Then my people want me to go to Oxford." Wharton gave a contemptuous shrug of the shoulders. It was a new experience for Philip to learn that there were persons who did not look upon that seat of learning with awe. "What d'you want to go there for? You'll only be a glorified schoolboy. Why don't you matriculate here? A year's no good. Spend 5 years here. You know, there are two good things in life, freedom of thought and freedom of action. In France you get freedom of action. You can do what you like and nobody bothers, but you must think like everybody else. In Germany you must do what everybody else does, but you may think as you choose. They're both very good things. I personally prefer freedom of thought. But in England you get neither. You're ground down by convention. You can't think as you like and you can't act as you like. That's because it's a democratic nation. I expect America's worse." He leaned back cautiously, for the chair on which he sat had a rickety leg, and it was disconcerting when a rhetorical flourish was interrupted by a sudden fall to the floor. "I ought to go back to England this year, but if I can scrape together enough to keep body and soul on speaking terms, I shall stay another 12 months. But then I shall have to go. And I must leave all this." He waved his arm round the dirty garret, with its unmade bed, the clothes lying on the floor, a row of empty beer bottles against the wall, piles of unbound ragged books in every corner. "For some provincial university where I shall try and get a chair of philology. And I shall play tennis and go to tea parties." He interrupted himself and gave Philip, very neatly dressed, with a clean collar on and his hair well brushed, a quizzical look. "And my God, I shall have to wash." Philip reddened, feeling his own spruceness an intolerable reproach, for of late he had begun to pay some attention to his toilet, and he had come out from England with a pretty selection of ties. The summer came upon the country like a conqueror. Each day was beautiful. The sky had an arrogant blue which goaded the nerves like a spur. The green of the trees in the Anlage was violent and crude, and the houses, when the sun caught them, had a dazzling white which stimulated till it hurt. Sometimes on his way back from Wharton, Philip would sit in the shade on one of the benches in the Anlage, enjoying the coolness and watching the patterns of light which the sun, shining through the leaves, made on the ground. His soul danced with delight as gaily as the sunbeams. He revelled in those moments of idleness stolen from his work. Sometimes he sauntered through the streets of the old town. He looked with awe at the students of the corps, their cheeks gashed and red, who swaggered about in their coloured caps. In the afternoons he wandered about the hills with the girls in the Frau Professor's house, and sometimes they went up the river and had tea in a leafy beer garden. In the evenings they walked round and round the Stadtgarten listening to the band. Philip soon learned the various interests of the household. Fraulein Thekla, the Professor's elder daughter, was engaged to a man in England who had spent 12 months in the house to learn German, and their marriage was to take place at the end of the year. But the young man wrote that his father, an India rubber merchant who lived in Slough, did not approve of the union, and Fraulein Thekla was often in tears. Sometimes she and her mother might be seen, with stern eyes and determined mouths, looking over the letters of the reluctant lover. Thekla painted in water colour, and occasionally she and Philip, with another of the girls to keep them company, would go out and paint little pictures. The pretty Fraulein Hedwig had amorous troubles too. She was the daughter of a merchant in Berlin, and a dashing hussar had fallen in love with her, a von if you please, but his parents opposed a marriage with a person of her condition, and she had been sent to Heidelberg to forget him. She could never do this, and corresponded with him continually, and he was making every effort to induce an exasperating father to change his mind. She told all this to Philip with pretty sighs and becoming blushes, and showed him the photograph of the gay lieutenant. Philip liked her best of all the girls at the Frau Professor's, and on their walks always tried to get by her side. He blushed a great deal when the others chaffed him for his obvious preference. He made the first declaration in his life to Fraulein Hedwig, but unfortunately it was an accident, and it happened in this manner. In the evenings when they did not go out, the young women sang little songs in the green velvet drawing room, while Fraulein Anna, who always made herself useful, industriously accompanied. Fraulein Hedwig's favourite song was Ich liebe dich, I love you, and one evening after she had sung this, when Philip was standing with her on the balcony looking at the stars, it occurred to him to make some remark about it. He began, Ich liebe dich. His German was halting, and he looked about for the word he wanted. The pause was infinitesimal, but before he could go on Fraulein Hedwig said, Ach, Herr Carey, Sie müssen mir nicht du sagen. You mustn't talk to me in the second person singular. Philip felt himself grow hot all over, for he would never have dared to do anything so familiar, and he could think of nothing on earth to say. It would be ungallant to explain that he was not making an observation, but merely mentioning the title of a song. Entschuldigen Sie, he said. I beg your pardon. It does not matter, she whispered. She smiled pleasantly, quietly, took his hand and pressed it, then turned back into the drawing-room. Next day he was so embarrassed that he could not speak to her, and in his shyness did all that was possible to avoid her. When he was asked to go for the usual walk he refused because he said he had work to do. But Fraulein Hedwig seized an opportunity to speak to him alone. "Why are you behaving this way?" she said kindly. "You know I'm not angry with you for what you said last night. You can't help it if you love me. I'm flattered. But although I'm not exactly engaged to Hermann, I can never love anyone else, and I look upon myself as his bride." Philip blushed again, but he put on quite the expression of a rejected lover. "I hope you'll be very happy," he said. Chapter 24